The island does not appear suddenly. It forms slowly from the grey horizon, a dark outline against colder water. There are no docks, no welcoming shape, only uneven rock rising from the sea, worn down by years of wind and salt. The air smells metallic and sharp. Nothing here suggests arrival. The island feels less like a destination and more like something that has chosen to remain where others pass. Waves meet the rocks in a steady rhythm, not violent, not calm. They strike, withdraw, and return again without urgency. The sound is constant, but never dominant. It blends with the wind and disappears inside it. The sea does not demand attention. It simply continues circling the island, touching its edges in small repeated gestures. At the highest point stands the lighthouse, tall, narrow, and weathered by salt and weather. The paint has faded unevenly. Metal edges carry thin traces of rust. It does not tower in arrogance. It stands because it was built to stand, vertical against a horizontal world of water and sky. Beside it rests a small stone house, low walls, narrow windows, a door facing the open sea. The ground around it shows no clear path, only compressed patches where footsteps have passed enough times to suggest routine. Nothing decorative, nothing unnecessary, only what endures wind and repetition. One person lives here alone. The length of their stay is not recorded. Time behaves differently on the island. Days are measured in light, wind direction, and the sound of waves changing tone against the rock. The body has learned these measures without naming them. They wake before the horizon softens into light. There is no alarm, no clock visible in the room. Sleep releases its hold gradually, like the tide pulling away from rock. The small bedroom remains cool and dim. The walls carry the faint scent of salt and oil. The sea can be heard even with eyes closed. It does not grow louder, it never grows silent. They sit upright on the edge of the narrow bed and remain there for a moment, not thinking, not planning. The body adjusts to being awake. Wind presses lightly against the outer walls. The structure absorbs the force without complaint. The day has not begun yet. It simply exists, waiting to be entered. Ooh. Heavy clothing waits on a wooden chair. Thick wool, practical layers, fabric shaped by years of use. The coat smells faintly of fuel and sea air. Boots stand by the door, stiff but dependable. Nothing here is chosen for comfort. Everything is chosen because it endures. The spiral staircase inside the lighthouse rises in a narrow column of shadow. Metal steps curve upward, steep and familiar. They begin the climb without hesitation. Each step produces a dull, contained sound. The sound travels upward and disappears before it reaches the top. At the lantern room, the glass lens waits behind its frame. Thick panes, slightly fogged by salt carried in through invisible cracks. The mechanism hums faintly. The light is not on yet. It rests in readiness. They begin wiping the glass in slow circular motions. The cloth moves steadily. The sea leaves its mark each day. The act of removing it repeats without conclusion. They finish cleaning the lens and stand still for a moment inside the lantern room. The horizon stretches in every direction, uninterrupted. No boats cut across the surface. No smoke rises in the distance. The sea expands outward without offering sign of life. The height does not create superiority. It only creates distance. They descend the spiral staircase at the same measured pace. The body does not rush downward. Each step lands evenly. The sound of metal underfoot remains steady and contained. The staircase does not echo loudly. It holds the noise within its narrow cylinder. Back inside the small house, they light a modest stove. The flame forms slowly beneath a small metal pot. The room warms only slightly, enough to soften the chill, not enough to change the character of the air. The sea continues speaking outside, unaffected. They prepare a simple meal. Bread kept dry in cloth, a small portion of preserved fish, water heated until steam barely rises, nothing elaborate, nothing varied. The repetition of the meal mirrors the repetition of the tide. They eat standing near the window, looking outward without focusing on anything specific. The horizon remains empty. The wind shifts direction slightly. The change is subtle. The body notices before the mind does. After eating, they rinse the small metal cup with a measured amount of water and set it upside down beside the stove. The surface of the table shows faint marks from years of similar mornings. Nothing is polished away. Nothing is restored. The room carries quiet in its corners, thick and undisturbed. Outside, the wind shifts again, brushing the walls in a low, constant tone. They step outside and pause just beyond the door. The air feels sharper now, carrying more salt. The sea stretches wide and colorless beneath a pale sky. No vessel moves along the horizon. No smoke line suggests distance. The island feels separated not by miles but by absence. The wind presses steadily against their coat without urgency. They walk slowly around the perimeter of the lighthouse, inspecting bolts, hinges, and narrow seams where salt tends to gather. The work is repetitive and rarely urgent. Fingers trace metal edges worn by years of exposure. The structure does not appear fragile. It appears accustomed to endurance. The rocks near the edge of the island are uneven and damp. Waves meet them in steady repetition, leaving thin lines of foam that fade within seconds. They stand there briefly, watching the motion without expectation. The sea does not perform. It does not vary its pattern for observation. When they turn back toward the lighthouse, the vertical structure appears unchanged against the wide horizontal expanse. It stands because it must stand. The island remains because it cannot move. The light will return tonight, whether or not anyone sees it from the water. They re-enter the lighthouse and begin the slow ascent once more. The spiral staircase narrows toward the top, metal cool beneath steady hands. Each step carries the same muted sound as before, absorbed by the circular walls. There is no variation in pace. The climb has been repeated enough times that the body performs it without guidance. Inside the lantern room, they inspect the mechanism that turns the light. Gears sit in quiet readiness, coated lightly in oil. Nothing appears broken. Nothing appears newly repaired. The machine does not suggest innovation. It suggests continuity, a system built to repeat the same action night after night. They adjust a small lever and test the rotation with careful attention. The lens shifts fractionally, aligning with a movement practiced countless times before. Precision here does not seek perfection. It seeks consistency. The sea will not thank the light. The sea will not acknowledge it. They pause at the window and look outward again. The horizon remains empty, as if erased. The sky and water share nearly the same tone. Wind brushes lightly against the glass. The world beyond feels wide, but not inviting. They descend once more and step outside into open air. The island remains small beneath an expansive sky. The lighthouse casts a narrow shadow across the uneven ground. It stretches slightly, then softens as clouds pass overhead. They remain outside for a long moment after stepping down from the lighthouse. The wind moves steadily across the island, not strong enough to demand resistance, yet constant enough to be felt in every layer of clothing. The sea expands in all directions, a muted field of grey shifting under a pale sky. Nothing breaks the surface, nothing approaches. The island exists alone within that wide, indifferent space. They walk slowly toward the far edge of the rocks, careful but unhurried. The stone beneath their boots is worn smooth in some places and sharp in others. Years of tide have carved subtle channels that hold thin pools of water. Each step is deliberate, though not cautious. The body has learned the shape of this ground through repetition, memorizing its irregularities without ever mapping them. Standing near the edge, they look downward at waves meeting the rock. The motion repeats without variation. Water rises, presses against stone, then falls back, leaving behind a thin line of foam that dissolves almost immediately. The sound is steady and low. It does not crash. It does not whisper. It continues in a tone that feels neither gentle nor harsh, only persistent. They remain there long enough for the horizon to shift slightly in tone. Clouds drift without clear direction, thinning and gathering again in slow formation. The lighthouse behind them stands unmoved, vertical, and quiet. It does not dominate the landscape. It simply marks a point where structure meets exposure. The island feels suspended between sea and sky, belonging fully to neither. When they turn back toward the house, nothing in the environment acknowledges the movement. The wind continues, the waves continue, the clouds continue their slow rearrangement. The lighthouse will shine again tonight, whether or not any vessel passes within sight. The light exists not as response, but as continuation of a task that does not require recognition. They enter the small stone house and close the door behind them. The wind continues outside, but its force becomes muted once filtered through thick walls. The interior carries a faint smell of oil, salt, and old wood. Nothing inside feels decorative. Every object has weight and purpose. The room holds silence differently than the open air. It feels contained, as if the quiet has settled into the corners and chosen to remain. They move toward a small storage cabinet and check the fuel containers lined along the back wall. Metal cans sit in ordered rows, each marked with careful notches that indicate usage. The inspection is slow and methodical. No urgency guides the process. The light depends on this fuel, and the fuel depends on steady attention. A small notebook rests on the table. Pages filled with simple entries: wind direction, cloud density, visibility distance, mechanical checks. The handwriting remains consistent from page to page. Dates appear in a narrow column. The entries do not express feeling. They record continuation. They open the notebook and add a new line. The pen moves steadily across the paper. The ink does not hesitate. Once written, the notebook is closed and returned to its place. No reflection follows. The act of recording does not deepen meaning. It simply confirms that the day has occurred. The afternoon light begins to shift subtly, though no clock marks the hour. The sky grows slightly heavier. The sea darkens by a small degree. The lighthouse stands waiting for its next task. The person inside the house moves with the same measured pace, preparing for a night that will resemble the one before it. They step outside again as the afternoon thins into a quieter light. The wind has shifted slightly, pressing more firmly against the eastern side of the structure. The sea appears darker now, not because it has changed, but because the sky above it has grown heavier. The island remains exposed on all sides, without shelter from horizon to horizon. Nothing interrupts the view. Nothing interrupts the solitude. They walk once more around the base of the lighthouse, running a hand along the outer wall. The surface feels rough beneath their palm, textured by years of salt carried inland by wind. Small imperfections mark the paint. None are repaired immediately. Maintenance here is steady, not reactive. The structure does not demand perfection. It demands endurance. A narrow metal hatch near the base of the tower is checked and secured. The hinge moves with a low sound, then settles. Every latch is tested with deliberate pressure. The island may feel empty, but the ritual remains exact. The work does not assume absence of need. It assumes that need might appear without warning. They pause facing the open sea. The horizon remains unbroken. No distant silhouette suggests a vessel. The wind moves through their coat, pressing fabric gently against the body. The air smells colder now. Evening is approaching, though it has not yet declared itself. They look up at the lantern room above. Soon the light will rotate again, casting its steady arc across water that may not reflect it back. The action does not depend on witness. The light turns because it must turn. As the sky lowers into evening, they climb the spiral staircase once more. The ascent feels slightly heavier now, not from fatigue but from repetition accumulated across the day. The metal steps remain cool beneath steady hands. Each movement follows the same sequence practiced countless times before. Nothing about the climb is dramatic. It is an obligation fulfilled without resistance. Inside the lantern room, the air feels thinner, touched by drafts slipping through narrow seams. The glass lens reflects the fading daylight in fractured angles. They check the mechanism again, adjusting the timing of rotation with careful precision. The system does not allow improvisation. It requires steadiness. They ignite the light slowly, watching as the beam strengthens within the housing. The first rotation moves across the darkening sea in a controlled arc. It does not flare. It does not announce itself loudly. It extends outward in measured intervals, slicing through air that may carry no one beneath it. From above, the island appears smaller still. The rocks dissolve into shadow. The house below holds a dim interior glow. The sea stretches beyond reach, vast and unbroken. The beam continues turning at steady intervals, a rhythm that does not depend on response. They remain standing near the lens, observing the rotation without emotional attachment. The light passes, returns, passes again. Each cycle identical to the last. The night settles gradually around the tower, absorbing everything except the narrow line of illumination sweeping outward into darkness. After confirming the rotation is steady, they descend the spiral staircase once more. Night has fully settled now, and the interior of the tower feels narrower under artificial light. The metal steps reflect faint glimmers from above. Each downward movement is deliberate, measured, unchanged from the countless descents before it. The body performs its duty without hesitation or fatigue. Outside, darkness has replaced the horizon. The sea is no longer a visible field, but a presence felt through sound. Waves continue striking rock in steady repetition. The beam from the lantern room passes overhead in slow intervals, cutting briefly across the island before disappearing again into blackness. They step into the small house and close the door against the wind. The interior holds a softer darkness, shaped by a single low lamp near the table. Shadows stretch along the stone walls. The room feels smaller at night, as if the outside space presses inward without ever entering. They prepare a modest evening meal, similar to the one from earlier. Bread, preserved fish, heated water. The repetition does not feel limiting. It feels aligned with the rhythm of the island. The body accepts the same nourishment without protest. After eating, they sit quietly near the table, listening to the wind move across the outer walls. The beam above continues its rotation. The light passes unseen over distant water, whether needed or not. They remain seated long after the meal is finished. The small lamp casts a steady glow across the table, revealing faint scratches in the wood from years of use. Outside, the wind presses against the stone walls in long, uninterrupted currents. The sea continues its slow collision with rock. Nothing inside the house attempts to compete with that sound. From time to time, the beam from the lighthouse passes across the window. For a brief second, the room brightens slightly before returning to its previous dimness. The cycle repeats at measured intervals. The light does not demand acknowledgement. It simply marks its own presence in passing. They stand and check the door latch once more. Fingers press against the metal to ensure it holds firmly. The gesture is small but precise. The island does not forgive negligence, even when it appears calm. Every action taken here assumes continuity rather than crisis. They extinguish the small lamp and allow the room to settle into near darkness. Only faint traces of the rotating beam reach inside now, briefly outlining furniture before vanishing again. The sea remains audible, steady and unchanged. They move toward the narrow bed and sit down slowly. The day does not feel complete. It simply reaches a point where movement becomes unnecessary. The body lowers itself into rest without ceremony. They lie back on the narrow bed and remain awake for a while, listening to the rhythm of the sea beyond the walls. The mattress carries the shape of long use, neither soft nor hard, simply familiar. The wind continues its steady passage around the structure. The beam above rotates with unwavering precision, marking intervals in darkness without ever announcing them. The house settles gradually as night deepens. Stone absorbs the cold. Wood adjusts to shifting air pressure. Small sounds appear and fade without pattern. None of them suggest disturbance. They are only the quiet mechanics of endurance. Sleep arrives without transition. There is no sudden drift. The body releases itself in small increments, surrendering to the same rhythm that has governed the island all day. Outside, the beam continues its arc across water that may hold no witness. Hours pass without measure. The light turns. The wind moves. Waves meet rock and withdraw again. The island does not alter its posture in darkness. It holds its position as firmly as it did in daylight. Before dawn, The rotation continues one final cycle of the night. The beam slices through thinning darkness, then begins to lose contrast as the horizon slowly lightens. The light has performed its duty whether or not anyone needed it. Dawn approaches gradually without sudden color. The sky lightens in thin layers, soft gray replacing deeper tones of night. The beam from the lighthouse becomes less distinct against the growing brightness. It continues turning, though its edge now fades into the emerging day. The sea shifts from black to muted steel, revealing texture where darkness once concealed it. Inside the house they wake before the light fully settles. The body responds to the subtle change in air rather than to visible brightness. The room remains cool. The walls carry the same faint scent of salt and oil. Outside, the wind has softened slightly, though the sea maintains its steady rhythm. They sit upright and listen. The beam above completes its final rotation before being extinguished. The transition is quiet. No dramatic ending marks the night's conclusion. The light simply stops because daylight has begun to take its place. They rise from the bed and pull on the same heavy layers as the day before. The coat hangs where it was left. The boots remain positioned near the door. Nothing in the room has shifted overnight. The repetition carries no resistance. It feels aligned with the structure of the island itself. They step outside into early morning air. The horizon appears clearer now, though still empty. The lighthouse stands behind them, silent in daylight. The island prepares for another cycle that will resemble the one before it, differing only in small, nearly invisible ways. They begin the morning inspection without hesitation. The spiral staircase rises again in its narrow column, and their steps follow the same measured rhythm as yesterday. The metal remains cool beneath steady hands. Nothing about the climb suggests novelty. It is a continuation rather than a beginning, a motion resumed rather than initiated. Inside the lantern room, daylight reveals small details overlooked at night. Fine grains of salt cling to the edges of the glass. The mechanism rests after its long rotation. They examine the housing with quiet focus, confirming that nothing has shifted out of place during the darkness. The cloth moves slowly across the lens once more, circular motions repeated with precision. The glass clears gradually, though it never remains fully untouched by the sea. The island does not allow permanence of cleanliness. It allows only maintenance. They pause at the window and scan the horizon again. The water stretches wide and pale beneath the morning sky. No vessel approaches. No distant silhouette suggests interruption. The emptiness does not feel dramatic. It feels consistent. They descend the staircase and step back onto open ground. The day has fully formed now, though it carries no sharp definition. The wind moves lightly across the island. The lighthouse stands silent, waiting for the hour when it will once again be required to shine. They walk slowly along the outer edge of the island, following no marked path, only the memory of where stone holds firm. The sea stretches outward in muted shades of grey and pale blue. The horizon appears slightly clearer than the day before, yet equally empty. The wind presses lightly against their coat, carrying the same salt-laced air that never truly leaves the island. Small pools of water gather in depressions between rocks. The surface of each pool reflects fragments of sky, distorted by faint ripples caused by wind. They pause near one of them, observing the shifting reflection without attempting to interpret it. The water holds the sky briefly, then breaks the image apart. The mist thins as the light continues to change, not brighter, just different. The edge of the lake becomes easier to sense, though still difficult to define. The forest remains a dark mass beyond the water. Individual trees are present, but they do not announce themselves. They turn back toward the lighthouse, which rises vertically against the open sky. In daylight it appears less dramatic, almost modest in its structure. Its purpose is not visible in brightness. It waits for darkness to define it. They re-enter the house and prepare the midday meal. The repetition feels neither dull nor comforting. It simply aligns with the steady pattern of the island. Outside, the sea continues its quiet conversation with stone, unchanged by the passing of another morning. After eating, they rinse the utensils with measured care and set them back in their usual places. The arrangement on the table returns to its quiet order. The small room absorbs the movement without alteration. Outside, daylight holds steady, neither bright nor dim. The island does not shift its posture beneath the sky. It remains exposed, patient, and unchanged. They step outside once more and stand facing the sea. The horizon appears faintly clearer, yet still without interruption. No line suggests a vessel. No disturbance marks the surface. The water continues its slow exchange with rock, leaving thin traces of foam that dissolve almost immediately after forming. Wind moves across the lighthouse wall, producing a low, steady tone as it passes narrow seams in the metal. The sound is neither sharp nor soft. It blends into the larger rhythm of the island. They walk along the base of the structure, checking its surface with the same deliberate attention as before. The afternoon begins lowering gradually. Shadows extend slightly along the uneven ground. The light loses a small measure of brightness without announcing the change. They pause at the edge of the rocks again, looking outward without searching for anything specific. The lighthouse remains silent in daylight, its lantern room dark and still. Soon it will turn again, slicing measured intervals across water that may hold no witness. For now, it waits, vertical and patient, anchored to the island that refuses to move. The afternoon thins gradually, light losing sharpness without fully fading. The sea reflects a dull, metallic sheen beneath the lowering sky. They walk once more around the perimeter of the island, boots pressing into familiar stone. No part of the ground feels foreign. The body moves with quiet certainty, guided by repetition rather than attention. Clouds gather in loose formations above the horizon, shifting slowly without direction. The air carries a slight change in temperature, subtle enough to register only after standing still. They pause near the outer rocks, watching the water move in small, steady pulses. Nothing accelerates, nothing retreats. They return to the lighthouse as the first suggestion of evening approaches. The structure appears darker now, its vertical line more defined against the softening sky. The lantern room above waits without glow, a silent chamber prepared for its nightly cycle. Inside the house, they check the fuel containers once more. The metal surfaces reflect dim afternoon light. Levels remain steady. The ritual inspection does not arise from doubt. It arises from habit, refined over time, where repetition ensures continuity. They close the cabinet and stand briefly in the center of the room. The air feels slightly heavier as daylight wanes. Outside, the wind shifts direction again, brushing against the walls in a low, constant current. The island prepares quietly for another descent into darkness. They step outside once more, as evening lowers itself across the island. The horizon softens into a muted gradient of grey and pale blue. The sea darkens incrementally, absorbing the remaining light. Wind moves in steady, uninterrupted streams across exposed stone. The lighthouse stands silent but alert, its upper chamber waiting for the moment when daylight fully releases its hold. They begin the ascent again, hands sliding along the cool metal rail of the spiral staircase. The climb feels identical to the one from the night before. The repetition does not create monotony, it creates stability. Each step lands evenly, echoing faintly within the cylindrical space before dissolving into stillness. Inside the lantern room, dusk filters through the glass in subdued tones. They inspect the mechanism with steady attention, checking alignment and fuel feed with practiced movements. The structure responds with quiet readiness. Nothing here demands urgency. Everything demands constancy. They ignite the light slowly, watching the first arc sweep outward across darkening water. The beam grows stronger as night gathers. It does not flash. It rotates in deliberate intervals, marking presence across distances that may carry no witness to receive it. He moves toward the tree line and stops just short of entering it. From here, the cabin, the lake, and the skiff remain visible. None of them appear closer than the others. They remain in the lantern room for a long moment, observing the steady rhythm of rotation. The beam sweeps outward, disappears into darkness. then returns in identical measure. Each interval mirrors the last without deviation. The sea below absorbs the light without reflection. From this height, nothing suggests whether the beam is seen or simply dissolves into empty distance. The wind presses against the glass panels with a low, continuous tone. The structure holds firm. Metal and stone have endured many nights like this. They rest one hand briefly against the interior wall, feeling the faint vibration carried upward from the sea striking rock below. They descend the spiral staircase once more. The narrow cylinder feels darker now, illuminated only by small interior lamps placed along the curve. Each step lands with quiet certainty. The descent feels neither long nor short. It simply continues until ground level returns. Outside, night has fully settled. The sea is no longer visible, only audible. Waves strike rock in steady repetition, rising and withdrawing without variation. The beam passes overhead at measured intervals, briefly tracing a pale arc across stone before vanishing again. They enter the small house and close the door behind them. The interior feels contained, protected from direct wind, yet never separated from its sound. A low lamp casts soft illumination across the table. Shadows stretch gently along the walls, forming shapes that shift with each rotation of the distant beam. They prepare the evening meal once more, repeating the same quiet sequence of movements. Bread is unwrapped from cloth. Preserved fish is placed on a simple plate. Water is heated slowly over a small flame. The actions do not vary. They follow a pattern shaped by necessity rather than preference. Outside, the beam continues its steady rotation, marking intervals across unseen water. They eat near the window without turning on additional light. The lamp remains low, casting only enough brightness to define the table's edge. Occasionally, the rotating beam passes across the glass, briefly brightening the interior before fading again. The cycle continues without interruption, independent of appetite or thought. After the meal, they clean the utensils carefully and return them to their place. The small room resumes its ordered stillness. The wind presses steadily against the stone walls, carrying salt that will settle again by morning. Nothing inside resists the outside completely. It only filters it. They sit quietly for a long while, listening to the combined rhythm of wind, waves, and rotating light. The island feels suspended in darkness, held between sea and sky. No vessel passes. No distant glow appears on the horizon. The night remains uninterrupted. Eventually, they rise and extinguish the lamp. The room dims to near darkness. Only the passing beam from above traces faint lines across the walls at regular intervals. The lighthouse continues shining into distance, whether needed or not, fulfilling its cycle without witness. They lie down slowly on the narrow bed, the mattress shaped by years of similar nights. The wind continues its steady movement across the outer walls, neither increasing nor fading. The beam above completes each rotation with quiet precision, cutting briefly across the darkness before dissolving again. Nothing in the night suggests interruption or urgency. The island holds its position without strain. Sleep arrives gradually, not as a sudden descent but as a soft withdrawal from wakefulness. The body releases tension in small increments, aligning with the steady rhythm that governs the sea and wind. Outside, waves continue their measured contact with rock, rising and receding in unbroken sequence. Hours pass without marker. The light turns. The wind shifts slightly, clouds rearrange beyond sight. The island does not respond to these changes with movement. It remains fixed, absorbing each alteration without reaction. Before dawn, the beam continues its final rotations of the night. The horizon begins to lighten imperceptibly, thinning the contrast between sea and sky. The light grows less distinct against the emerging grey, though it still completes its cycle with unwavering timing. Inside the house, they wake before daylight fully forms. The room remains cool and dim. The sea's sound arrives clearly through stone walls. The night's rotation will soon give way to the morning's inspection, and the cycle will continue once more without variation. They rise from the bed and sit quietly for a moment, listening to the thinning sound of night. The beam above completes one of its last arcs before being extinguished. The transition does not announce itself. The light simply stops when daylight becomes sufficient. The room remains unchanged, holding the same restrained quiet it carried the evening before. They dress in the same steady sequence, layering wool and fastening boots without hesitation. The coat carries the faint scent of oil and salt, unchanged from the previous day. The body moves with familiarity, repeating motions refined over many mornings without conscious adjustment. They step outside into early light. The horizon appears pale and indistinct, the sea reflecting muted tones of grey. The lighthouse stands silent now, its lantern dark in daylight. The island resumes its exposed stillness beneath a sky that offers no clear promise of change. They begin the ascent once more, hands sliding along the cool rail of the spiral staircase. The climb feels neither long nor short. It simply continues until the lantern room opens above. The metal steps echo softly, the sound dissolving upward into the circular chamber. Inside, they inspect the mechanism with the same measured care as every morning. Gears sit ready. Glass carries a faint layer of salt once again. The work resumes not because something failed, but because continuity demands attention. They wipe the lens again in slow circular movements, clearing the faint residue left by wind and salt. The cloth glides steadily across thick glass, restoring clarity that will not remain for long. The island does not allow permanence in such matters. Maintenance here is not an effort to perfect, but an effort to sustain what already exists. After finishing the inspection, they stand quietly in the lantern room and look outward. Morning light spreads evenly across the sea, revealing a textured surface where night once concealed depth. The horizon remains empty. No line suggests a vessel approaching. The openness feels vast but not inviting. They descend the staircase and step onto open ground. The wind has softened slightly, though it never fully disappears. The sea continues its measured rhythm against rock. The lighthouse casts a narrow shadow across the uneven terrain, stretching faintly beneath the growing light. They walk along the island's edge once more, tracing the same route as before. The stone beneath their boots feels familiar in every contour. Small pools of water reflect fragments of sky that shift with passing clouds. The body moves without calculation, guided by repetition rather than attention. They pause near the far rocks and look outward again. The horizon remains unbroken. The island stands alone within a field of water and sky, neither isolated by drama nor connected by passage. The day continues forming itself without offering distinction from the one before. They turn back toward the lighthouse and walk at the same measured pace. The structure rises in clean vertical contrast against the widening sky. Daylight reveals its surface more clearly now, highlighting small imperfections left by years of exposure. None of these marks suggest decay. They suggest endurance, a record of weather absorbed without resistance. Inside the small house, they check the storage cabinet once more. Fuel containers remain aligned along the wall, levels marked with quiet precision. The inspection follows the same order as always, hands moving without pause from one container to the next. The ritual does not arise from doubt. It arises from discipline shaped by isolation. They open the notebook and record the morning's observations: wind direction, visibility, mechanical status. The handwriting remains steady, narrow, and consistent across each page. The entries contain no reflection, no interpretation. They mark continuation rather than meaning. Closing the notebook, they stand briefly near the window. The sea stretches outward in muted tones. Light glints faintly off small moving surfaces, but nothing larger interrupts the view. The island does not anticipate arrival. It does not prepare for departure. It remains as it is. The day advances quietly. No bell marks the hour. No signal divides morning from afternoon. The island exists within a slow progression of light, wind, and repetition, carrying forward without variation or urgency. They prepare the midday meal with the same restrained sequence as before. Bread is unwrapped from cloth and broken into small portions. Preserved fish is placed on a plain surface without arrangement. Water warms slowly over a steady flame. The room carries the faint sound of boiling and wind together, blending into a single, continuous presence. They eat near the narrow window, looking outward without seeking detail. The horizon remains unbroken. The sea reflects a muted sheen beneath drifting clouds. The act of eating does not divide the day into segments. It simply fills a necessary interval within the larger cycle. After finishing, they rinse utensils with measured care and return each item to its place. The small table resumes its quiet arrangement. No crumbs remain. No excess movement lingers in the air. The interior returns to stillness as naturally as water returns to level. They step outside and stand facing the open water once more. The wind shifts subtly, pressing from a slightly different angle against their coat. The sea's rhythm remains unchanged. The island holds its position between moving elements that never fully rest. Clouds gather in loose patterns across the sky, altering the tone of daylight without darkening it entirely. The lighthouse stands silent in brightness, its lantern room empty of glow. It waits for the hour when darkness will once again give its purpose definition. The afternoon settles into a muted steadiness. Light loses a fraction of its sharpness, though no clear boundary marks the change. They walk along the base of the lighthouse, checking hinges and small metal fittings exposed to wind. Fingers trace the edges with deliberate pressure. The inspection does not search for failure, it prevents it. They circle the structure slowly, observing its shadow stretch across uneven ground. The vertical line remains firm against the shifting sky. Nothing in its posture suggests strain. It stands as it stood yesterday and the day before that, absorbing weather without complaint. At the far edge of the island, waves continue meeting rock in steady repetition. The sound remains low and constant, never rising into violence. Foam gathers briefly in narrow channels before dissolving into thin lines of white. The sea does not pause. It does not escalate. It continues its measured exchange with stone. They remain near the rocks for a while, looking outward without expectation. No silhouette forms along the horizon. No distant vessel interrupts the field of grey and blue. The openness feels expansive but not inviting. It offers space without promise. When they turn back toward the house, evening has begun lowering itself across the island. The shift is subtle, noticeable only in the weight of air and the deepening tone of the sea. Soon, the lighthouse will resume its rotation, not because it is summoned, but because it must. They step inside the small house and close the door against the strengthening wind. The interior holds a softer atmosphere, though never entirely separate from the outside. The stone walls filter the sound rather than silence it. Evening light slips through the narrow window in muted tones, casting long, faint shadows across the floor. They check the fuel supply once more before night fully settles. The metal containers remain aligned in their ordered row. Each level is measured with quiet attention. Nothing appears diminished beyond expectation. The ritual is performed not from anxiety, but from discipline shaped by long isolation. Outside, the sky lowers gradually into dusk. The horizon loses definition, merging sea and sky into a single muted field. The lighthouse stands darker now against the fading light. Its upper chamber waits in shadow, prepared to transform once night arrives. They begin the ascent once more, hands steady along the spiral rail. The staircase curves upward in familiar darkness. Each step lands evenly, echoing faintly before dissolving into stillness. The climb does not feel repetitive. It feels necessary. Inside the lantern room, they prepare the mechanism for rotation. The lens reflects the last thin traces of daylight. As dusk deepens, they ignite the light again. The beam forms gradually, extending outward in a controlled arc across the darkening sea. The first full rotation of the night passes across the island in measured silence. The beam glides outward over water that offers no reflection back. Darkness absorbs most of its reach, leaving only a narrow suggestion of light where sea briefly catches its edge. The motion remains steady, mechanical, unwavering. They stand near the glass and watch the rhythm establish itself once more. The rotation does not quicken. It does not hesitate. Each arc repeats with identical timing. The night gathers around the structure, thick and unbroken beyond the reach of illumination. Wind presses harder now against the tower's exterior, producing a low, continuous tone through metal seams. The structure does not sway. It does not resist dramatically. It absorbs the force and holds its posture against the open sea. They descend the staircase again, leaving the lantern room to its steady cycle. The narrow cylinder of steps feels darker under night conditions. Small lamps cast dim guidance along the curve. Each footfall remains even, practiced, precise. Outside at ground level, the island has fully surrendered to darkness. The sea is present only through sound. Waves strike rock in the same measured pattern as always. The beam sweeps overhead, marking its intervals across water that may hold no witness. They enter the small house and close the door carefully against the wind. The interior holds a restrained warmth, carried by a low-burning flame. Shadows settle along the stone walls in soft, uneven shapes. Outside, the beam continues its measured sweep, briefly tracing pale light across the window before dissolving again into darkness. They prepare the evening meal with the same deliberate motions as the night before. Bread is broken into small portions. Preserved fish is arranged without variation. Water warms slowly in a modest pot. The repetition does not signal stagnation. It signals alignment with a rhythm that does not require novelty. They eat in near silence, listening to the layered sounds of wind and distant waves. Occasionally, the rotating beam brightens the room for a brief second before fading again. The cycle continues independent of appetite or thought, marking intervals without demanding attention. After the meal, they clean the utensils and return them to their places. The small house resumes its quiet order. No extra movement lingers in the air. The lamp remains low, casting just enough light to define the edge of the table and the outline of the door. They sit for a long while without shifting position. The wind presses steadily against the outer walls. The beam above rotates without pause. The island feels suspended between sea and sky, held in a balance that does not depend on witness. They extinguish the lamp and allow the room to dim almost completely. Only the passing beam from above traces faint lines across the interior at measured intervals. Each sweep briefly outlines the table, the chair, the edge of the door, then fades back into shadow. The rhythm remains constant, indifferent to whether it is observed. They move toward the narrow bed and sit slowly before lying down. The mattress holds the familiar contour of long repetition. Outside, wind maintains its steady current against stone and metal. The sea continues its quiet exchange with rock, unaltered by darkness. Sleep arrives gradually, not as a break but as a soft withdrawal from awareness. The body releases tension in small increments. The beam above continues its rotation through the night, completing arc after arc across water that may hold no vessel within sight. Hours pass without division. The lighthouse shines, the sea moves. The wind shifts subtly, altering tone but not intensity. The island remains fixed in its exposed position, absorbing each element without visible response. Before dawn, the beam continues its final rotations against thinning darkness. The horizon begins to lighten in gradual layers of grey. The light above grows less distinct as day prepares to replace it. The cycle does not end, it simply transitions. Dawn returns without spectacle. The sky lightens gradually, soft grey dissolving the last traces of night. The beam completes one of its final arcs before being extinguished. There is no ceremony in the transition. The light simply stops when daylight renders it unnecessary. The sea shifts from black to muted steel, revealing texture where darkness once concealed depth. Inside the house, they wake before the light fully settles. The room feels cool and unchanged. The sound of waves reaches through stone with steady clarity. The body sits upright and remains still for a moment, listening to the thinning wind and the sea's persistent rhythm beyond the walls. They dress in the same measured sequence as every morning. Wool layers, heavy coat, boots secured without haste. Nothing in the process suggests choice. It reflects repetition shaped by necessity and refined by solitude. They step outside into early light. The horizon appears clearer now, though still empty. The lighthouse stands silent in daylight, its lantern dark and still. The island resumes its exposed stillness beneath a sky that offers no clear promise of change. They begin the ascent once more, hands steady along the spiral rail. The climb feels identical to those before it. The staircase curves upward in quiet shadow, carrying them toward the lantern room, where inspection and maintenance will begin again. Inside the lantern room, morning light filters through the glass in muted tones. They inspect the mechanism carefully, checking alignment and fuel feed with practiced movements. Nothing appears out of place. Nothing suggests strain. The structure has endured another night without deviation from its steady rhythm. They wipe the lens once more, removing the fine layer of salt carried upward by wind. The cloth moves in slow, deliberate circles. Clarity returns gradually, though never permanently. The sea will leave its mark again before the day concludes. They pause at the window and scan the horizon in full daylight. The water stretches outward in pale grey and blue tones. No vessel breaks the line where sea meets sky. The openness remains vast, offering space without invitation. They descend the staircase and step back onto exposed ground. The wind has softened slightly, though it never fully rests. The lighthouse casts a narrow shadow across uneven rock, marking the steady movement of the sun without announcing it. The island resumes its daytime rhythm. Waves continue their measured exchange with stone. The house stands low and steady beside the tower. The person moves through the open space without urgency, aligned with repetition rather than expectation. Midday arrives without declaration. The sun rises higher, though its warmth remains modest against the persistent wind. They walk slowly along the edge of the island once more, tracing the familiar outline where rock meets water. The sea shifts in muted patterns beneath a pale sky, offering no sign of interruption. They pause near a shallow pool formed between stones. The water reflects fragments of cloud that drift above, breaking and reforming with each faint ripple. The reflection never holds steady for long. It shifts as quietly as the air itself. They turn toward the lighthouse and observe its vertical form against the open horizon. In daylight it appears almost modest. Its purpose rests dormant within the lantern room, waiting for darkness to restore its necessity. They return to the house and prepare a simple midday meal. Bread, preserved fish, heated water. The repetition carries no frustration. It aligns with the steady structure of the day. After eating, they stand near the window and look outward once more. The horizon remains empty. The island stands alone between sea and sky, suspended within its own measured cycle. They step outside again as afternoon begins its gradual descent. The light softens without fading completely, losing only a fraction of its sharpness. The sea darkens slightly beneath shifting clouds. Wind continues its steady passage across exposed stone, neither strong nor weak, simply present. The island remains fixed within that open field of water and sky. They walk along the base of the lighthouse, tracing metal fittings and checking small bolts with deliberate pressure. The structure responds with silent stability. Nothing wavers. Nothing requires sudden repair. The ritual does not assume failure. It preserves endurance through repetition. At the far rocks, waves continue their steady contact with stone. Foam gathers briefly, dissolving almost as soon as it forms. The sound remains low and even, never rising into violence. The sea does not alter its rhythm to signal passage of time. They remain there for a while, looking outward without expectation. The horizon remains unbroken. No distant silhouette appears. The openness feels expansive but neutral, offering no invitation and no rejection. As evening approaches, the lighthouse stands darker against the softening sky. Soon the lantern will rotate again, not because it is summoned, but because the cycle continues regardless of witness. They step inside the small house and close the door gently behind them. The wind continues outside, pressing against stone in long, uninterrupted currents. The interior holds a softer quiet, shaped by walls that filter sound without silencing it. Evening light slips through the narrow window in muted tones, stretching faint shadows across the floor. They check the fuel containers once more, hands moving from one metal surface to the next in steady sequence. Levels remain consistent. Nothing appears diminished beyond expectation. The inspection is not driven by worry. It is driven by habit, refined over years of repetition. Outside, dusk lowers gradually across sea and sky, merging both into a single field of grey. The lighthouse stands vertical against fading light, its lantern room dark and waiting. The island feels smaller as shadows lengthen, though nothing about its shape has changed. They begin the ascent again, climbing the spiral staircase with the same measured rhythm. Each step lands evenly, echoing faintly within the narrow column. The climb does not signal drama. It signals continuity. Inside the lantern room, they prepare the mechanism for night once more. The lens reflects the last thin traces of daylight. As darkness deepens, they ignite the light. The beam forms gradually, sweeping outward in a controlled arc across the darkening sea. The first full rotation of the night settles into its steady rhythm. The beam sweeps across open water in measured intervals, its edge briefly visible where sea catches light before returning to darkness. The motion does not quicken. It does not falter. It repeats with mechanical certainty, marking presence across a horizon that offers no sign of witness. They remain beside the glass for a while, watching the arc pass and return. Wind presses against the panels in a low, continuous tone. The structure holds firm, absorbing pressure without strain. From this height, the island dissolves into shadow, leaving only the narrow rotation of light as evidence of habitation. They descend the spiral staircase again, each step steady and practiced. The narrow column feels darker now, illuminated only by small interior lamps that guide the curve downward. The descent mirrors the climb in reverse, equal in pace and precision. At ground level, night has fully taken the island. The sea is present through sound alone, waves striking rock in familiar repetition. The beam passes overhead at regular intervals, tracing brief arcs across stone before vanishing again into the surrounding dark. They enter the small house and close the door against the wind. Inside, a low lamp casts restrained light across the table. Shadows settle into corners without disturbance. The lighthouse continues shining above, indifferent to whether anyone looks toward it from the sea. They prepare the evening meal once more, following the same restrained sequence as the nights before. Bread is unwrapped from cloth. Preserved fish is placed carefully on the table. Water warms in a modest pot over a steady flame. The repetition does not feel circular. It feels linear, extending forward through days that resemble one another, without becoming identical. They eat in near silence, listening to the layered rhythm of wind against stone and waves against rock. At measured intervals, the rotating beam briefly brightens the interior through the narrow window before fading again. The cycle continues without acknowledgement. After finishing, they clean the utensils and return them to their place with quiet precision. The small house resumes its ordered stillness. Nothing in the room signals completion. The lamp remains low, casting soft illumination that defines edges without revealing detail. They sit for a long while without movement. The wind shifts slightly in tone, but not in force. The beam continues its rotation above, marking intervals that no one may observe. The island feels suspended between elements that move endlessly around it. Eventually, they extinguish the lamp and allow the room to settle into darkness. Only the passing beam traces faint arcs across the interior at steady intervals. The lighthouse continues shining into distance, fulfilling its function without needing response or recognition. They move toward the narrow bed and lower themselves slowly onto it. The mattress yields with familiar resistance, shaped by years of repetition. Outside, the wind continues pressing steadily against stone and metal. The beam above completes its arc again, passing unseen across water that may hold no vessel within reach of sight. They lie still, listening to the layered rhythm of sea and wind merging into a single continuous tone. No abrupt sound breaks the pattern. The island does not signal disturbance. It remains fixed in its exposed position, held between moving elements that never fully rest. Sleep arrives gradually, not as a boundary but as a quiet withdrawal from awareness. The body releases tension in small increments, aligning once more with the steady cycle that governs the lighthouse and the sea. The beam continues its rotation through the night, unbroken and precise. Hours pass without measure. The lighthouse shines. The sea moves. The wind shifts subtly, altering its tone but not its presence. The island remains unchanged, absorbing each movement around it without visible response. Before dawn, the beam continues its final rotations against thinning darkness. The horizon begins to lighten in faint layers of grey. The light grows less distinct as day approaches, yet it completes its cycle without hesitation. The island prepares quietly for another repetition of the same unbroken rhythm. Dawn spreads slowly across the horizon, dissolving the final traces of night without spectacle. The beam completes one last arc before being extinguished. No sound marks the transition. The light simply stops when daylight renders it unnecessary. The sea shifts from deep shadow to muted steel, revealing texture where darkness once concealed movement. Inside the house, they wake before the sun fully settles above the horizon. The room feels unchanged, holding the same restrained quiet as every morning. The sound of waves arrives clearly through stone walls. The body sits upright and remains still, listening to the steady rhythm beyond. They dress once more in layered wool and heavy coat, fastening boots with practiced ease. Nothing in the process suggests novelty. The motions belong to repetition, shaped by necessity and refined by solitude. Outside, the lighthouse stands silent in daylight, its lantern resting until darkness calls it again. They step outside into pale morning air. The horizon appears empty, as it did the day before and the day before that. Wind moves lightly across exposed stone. The island remains small beneath the wide sky, neither seeking departure nor anticipating arrival. They look toward the sea without expectation. The openness stretches outward in muted tones of grey and blue. Nothing interrupts the line where water meets sky. The lighthouse stands behind them, quiet in daylight, waiting for its next cycle of illumination. They turn back toward the lighthouse and begin the morning ascent once more. The spiral staircase rises in its narrow column, metal cool beneath steady hands. Each step lands evenly, echoing faintly before dissolving upward into stillness. The climb does not announce a beginning. It continues what has never truly stopped. Inside the lantern room, daylight fills the glass in pale tones. They inspect the mechanism without variation, adjusting small details with measured precision. Nothing requires correction beyond the usual. The structure has endured another night exactly as it was meant to. They pause at the window and scan the horizon once more. The sea stretches outward without interruption. No silhouette forms in the distance. The openness remains vast and neutral, offering neither invitation nor refusal. They descend again and step onto open ground. The island feels unchanged beneath the wide sky. Waves continue meeting rock in steady repetition. Wind moves lightly across stone. The lighthouse stands silent in daylight, vertical and patient. Nothing concludes. The light will turn again when darkness returns. The sea will continue its measured exchange with stone. The island will remain where it stands, and the person within it will move through another cycle without announcement. The rotation continues, whether needed or not.